Imagine yourself as a time-traveling analyst hovering above Earth in 1860, tasked with predicting which nation will dominate the next 2 centuries. Your gaze sweeps across the continents. The British Empire sprawls across the map, literally controlling 1/4 of Earth's landmass. France stands as a cultural and military colossus. Russia looms as a sleeping giant with seemingly endless territory. Then your eyes land on the United States. What do you witness? A fractured, predominantly agricultural society ripping itself apart in what historians would call one of the bloodiest civil wars ever fought. Half the nation is literally burning the other half to ashes. The currency system is in shambles. The military pales in comparison to Prussia's war machine. If you'd wagered on America becoming the world's dominant power, any reasonable observer would have called you utterly insane. Fast forward just 85 years to 1945. Europe lies in ruins, a smoking wasteland. The British Empire is selling off its crown jewels just to feed its population. Japan has been reduced to ash. And the United States? The United States holds 50% of global GDP and 80% of the world's hard currency reserves. Its navy dwarfs all other naval forces combined. How did this transformation happen? Conventional history textbooks serve you a simplified narrative: freedom, democracy, and American exceptionalism. The actual story involves geographical advantages that border on cheating, calculated war profiteering, a systematically rigged financial architecture, and geopolitical maneuvering that would make Machiavelli look like an amateur. Strap in. We're about to dissect the American empire. Let's establish something up front. America didn't just get fortunate. It won the cosmic lottery. Before discussing banks, bombs, or political strategies, we need to examine geography. If you've ever engaged with strategy games like Civilization or Age of Empires, you understand that your spawn point determines your trajectory. The United States spawned in the most overpowered, game-breaking location imaginable. Consider the defensive positioning. The Atlantic Ocean guards the eastern frontier, a 3,000-mile-wide natural barrier. The Pacific Ocean protects the western flank. In military doctrine, these are called moats, massive aquatic obstacles that render a ground invasion of the mainland logistically impossible. While France and Germany spent a millennium slaughtering each other across their flat, shared border, the United States developed its economy in nearly complete security, without dedicating 50% of GDP to defensive fortifications. Here's the real game-changer that makes economists weep with envy: the Mississippi River Basin. This isn't merely a river. It represents the largest contiguous network of navigable waterways on the planet, 14,650 miles of routes where you can float commercial barges. Why does this matter so profoundly? Because water transport is extraordinarily cheap. Even today, moving cargo by water costs roughly 1/10 of trucking expenses and about 1/3 of rail costs. In the 1800s and early 1900s, before interstate highways existed, this advantage meant the difference between poverty and prosperity. A farmer in Iowa could float corn down to New Orleans and ship it worldwide for pennies on the dollar. Meanwhile, a farmer in Russia or Brazil faced mountains and hostile terrain, making their crops prohibitively expensive by the time they reached port. This river system generated an internal capital surplus that allowed America to accumulate wealth before even engaging seriously with international trade. Then there's the land itself. The American Midwest contains the largest contiguous stretch of high-quality arable land on Earth. But it's not just agricultural abundance. The United States sits atop massive deposits of coal, iron, or petroleum and natural gas. Unlike Great Britain, which colonized half the world to secure resources, or Japan, which invaded China seeking oil and rubber, America had everything within its own borders. It didn't require an empire to survive, it was an empire contained in a box. Now we must address the elephant in the room. This land wasn't uninhabited. These geographical advantages were secured through the systematic and brutal displacement of Native American populations and a war of conquest against Mexico in 1846. The U.S. government effectively seized the continent's prime real estate through force. By 1900, the United States had achieved what geopolitical strategists call strategic depth. Endless food production, unlimited fuel resources, impenetrable borders, and essentially free internal transportation. While Europe resembled a crowded knife fight in a telephone booth, America sat comfortably in a fortress constructed of gold. But possessing resources is one thing. Converting that into global dominance requires a crisis. And Europe was about to deliver a catastrophic one. The year is 1914. Europe embarks on collective suicide, World War I. When we discuss World War I, we typically hear about trenches, mustard gas, and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassination. But to understand American power, you need to examine the financial ledgers. Before 1914, the United States was actually a debtor nation. American companies and the government owed more to European investors, primarily British and French, than Europeans owed America. Wall Street functioned as essentially a branch office of London's financial district. Then the shooting started. Britain and France needed supplies, mountains of supplies. Bullets, artillery shells, rifles, wheat, cotton, steel. Since they were busy demolishing their own factories, they couldn't manufacture these items themselves. So they called Uncle Sam. American exports to Europe exploded. The U.S. transformed into the world's factory virtually overnight. Consider these numbers. In 1914, U.S. exports totaled roughly $2.4 billion. By 1916, that figure rocketed to $5.7 billion. Companies like DuPont became absolute titans. During the war, DuPont produced 40% of the gunpowder used by Allied forces. Their stock price skyrocketed by 355% during the war years. Here's where the real superpower machinery kicks into gear. Britain and France exhausted their gold reserves pretty quickly, spending everything on American weapons and supplies. How do you finance a war when you're bankrupt? You borrow. Who provided the loans? J.P. Morgan. The House of Morgan became the exclusive purchasing agent for the British Empire in the United States. They organized massive syndicates of American banks to lend billions to the Allies. By 1918, when the war ended, the script had completely flipped. Europe owed the United States roughly $10 billion, which adjusted for inflation relative to economic size represents a staggering sum. New York had displaced London as the world's financial epicenter. You might wonder, didn't the U.S. fight in the war? Yes, but barely. The U.S. didn't officially enter until 1917, 3 years after hostilities began. Think of it like a battle royale video game. The European powers spent 3 years bludgeoning each other, depleting their resources, burning through ammunition, and destroying their economies. The U.S. sat in the bushes, accumulating resources, upgrading equipment, and selling health potions to the combatants at 500% markup. When the U.S. finally entered the ring in 1917, it was fresh, wealthy, and industrializing faster than any nation in history. This massive influx of European wealth triggered the Roaring Twenties. That Great Gatsby lifestyle? Funded by interest payments from British and French treasuries. There was a sinister aspect. The U.S. was now the world's creditor, but it refused to act like a leader. It demanded full repayment of war debts while simultaneously imposing high tariffs that made it impossible for Europe to sell goods to America to earn repayment money. This economic mismanagement contributed to the Great Depression and ultimately Hitler's rise. But from a raw power perspective, the damage to Europe was done, and the torch had passed to Washington. However, America wasn't yet a military superpower. In the 1930s, the U.S. Army was roughly the size of Portugal's, tiny. To become the hegemon, America needed one more catastrophe. History was about to provide the biggest one of all. If World War I was the warm-up, World War II was the championship match. This is when the United States transcended from merely being a wealthy country to becoming a god-tier entity. The year is 1941. Hitler controls Europe. Japan rampages across the Pacific. The United States is mostly dormant, recovering from the Great Depression hangover. Then Pearl Harbor happens. What followed was the most extraordinary release of industrial capacity in human history. These numbers seem fictional because they're so extreme. President Franklin D. Roosevelt set targets everyone considered impossible. He demanded production of 50,000 aircraft annually. His advisors insisted it couldn't be done. By 1944, the U.S. was producing 96,000 aircraft per year. Ford Motor Company, formerly a car manufacturer, built the Willow Run plant, a facility 1 mile long. At peak production, it churned out one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Let that sink in. In the time required to watch a couple of TV episodes, Ford constructed a flying fortress capable of leveling a city. By war's end, the United States had manufactured 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2.6 million machine guns. Just like in World War I, the U.S. supplied the Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, with massive quantities of equipment through a program called Lend-Lease. We sent $50 billion worth of supplies, approximately $700 billion in today's currency. We sent 400,000 jeeps and trucks to the Soviet Union alone. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin explicitly acknowledged later that without American machinery, the USSR would have lost the war. Here's the cynical truth: Lend-Lease wasn't charity. It was leverage. By supplying the world, the U.S. made the entire Allied war effort dependent on American factories. While American production facilities ran 24/7 at peak efficiency, everyone else's factories were being bombed into rubble. The German industrial base, destroyed. The Japanese industrial base, incinerated. The British industrial base, bankrupt and bombed. The Soviet industrial base, ravaged by invasion. When the smoke cleared in 1945, the United States was the only major power remaining with its homeland intact. The U.S. possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The U.S. produced 60% of global industrial output. The U.S. was the only country with atomic weapons. The world had been leveled, and the United States was simultaneously the construction company, the bank, and the police force. But military dominance wasn't sufficient. They needed to guarantee they'd stay on top forever. They needed to rig the global economy. That brings us to an unassuming hotel in New Hampshire. While soldiers were still fighting in Normandy, bankers were battling in a luxurious New Hampshire hotel called Bretton Woods. The year is 1944. The war's outcome is essentially decided. The U.S. invites 44 nations to this hotel to determine how the global economy will function after the dust settles. This was the ultimate power play. The British sent their intellectual heavyweight, John Maynard Keynes, the world's most famous economist. He proposed a fair global currency called the Bancor that wouldn't favor any single country. The United States sent a man named Harry Dexter White. White essentially looked at Keynes and said, "That's a charming idea, John, but we possess all the gold, so we're implementing my plan." His plan was the Bretton Woods Agreement. Here's how it worked. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency, the pound, the franc, the lira, would be pegged to the US dollar. Understand what this means? It made the US dollar the official global reserve currency. If France wanted to purchase oil from Saudi Arabia, they couldn't pay in francs. The Saudis didn't want francs. They wanted dollars. This gave the United States an exorbitant privilege. The US could print green paper to buy real goods, cars, electronics, oil, from the rest of the world. Every other country had to actually manufacture and sell products to earn those dollars. It was like entering a casino where you're the only person permitted to print your own chips in the bathroom. To enforce this system, they created two organizations, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Officially, these exist to stabilize the global economy. Unofficially, they were designed to ensure that the global South remained accessible to American business and that Western Europe stayed dependent on American loans. The trap was set. The world was now financially addicted to Washington. But Europe was still a pile of rubble. And rubble doesn't purchase many Fords or Coca-Colas. By 1947, Europe was starving. Literally. People were eating tulip bulbs in the Netherlands. In this desperation, a new threat emerged: communism. Stalin and the Soviet Union eyed Western Europe, thinking, these people are broke and angry, perfect conditions for revolution. Communist parties in France and Italy were gaining massive support. The US panicked. If Europe turned communist, the US would lose its biggest export market and geopolitical buffer. Enter Secretary of State George Marshall. He proposed the Marshall Plan. The US gave Western Europe $13 billion, about $150 billion today, in aid to rebuild cities and factories. The catch. There's always a catch. History books frame this as a magnificent act of charity. But let's examine closer. This wasn't cash dropped from helicopters. The money came with strings attached. A huge portion of the aid credits had to be spent purchasing goods from the United States. It was a brilliant money laundering scheme for the U.S. economy. The U.S. government taxes American citizens. They give that money to France. France uses that money to buy tractors from U.S. corporations. The money flows right back to American businesses. It was a stimulus package for General Motors and U.S. Steel disguised as foreign aid. More importantly, it purchased loyalty. By accepting the money, Western European nations agreed to align their trade policies with the U.S. and keep communists out of power. It cemented the East-West divide. The Iron Curtain slammed shut, and the U.S. owned the western half. The Nazis are gone. Peace on earth, right? Wrong. The United States had a problem. Their entire economy had been constructed around war production. If they stopped building tanks and bombers, the Great Depression might return. They needed justification to keep the factories running. Fortunately, the Soviet Union was the perfect villain. In 1950, a secret government document called NSC 68 was drafted. It argued that the U.S. needed to maintain massive military buildup indefinitely to contain communism. This birthed the permanent war economy. This created a self-sustaining cycle known as the Iron Triangle. The military wants new weapons. Defense contractors like Lockheed, Boeing, and Raytheon want profitable contracts. Politicians want jobs for their districts to get re-elected. The contractors lobby the politicians. The politicians fund the military. The military buys from the contractors. Everyone profits except the taxpayer. This got so extreme that in 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general and war hero, used his farewell address to warn the country. He said Americans must guard against the military-industrial complex acquiring unwarranted influence. He was essentially saying, we've created a monster that feeds on conflict. If we're not careful, it will seek wars just to sustain itself. But here's the twist. This monster actually built the modern world. To stay ahead of the Soviets, the US government poured trillions into research and development. Need to communicate during nuclear war? The internet, ARPANET. Need to guide missiles precisely? GPS needs smaller guidance computers? Microchips. Need lighter aircraft materials? Advanced plastics and jet engines. Silicon Valley didn't start with two guys in a garage. It started with massive Department of Defense contracts. Your iPhone exists because the US wanted to destroy Moscow more efficiently than Moscow could destroy Washington. The US became a superpower not just by outgunning the world but by out-inventing it, using the military budget as a massive hidden industrial policy. But by the 1970s, the golden age was tarnishing. The rest of the world was catching up. The US was losing the Vietnam War and the dollar was in trouble. America needed another pivot. Time to change the game rules again. This time the target was the Middle East. Remember earlier when we said the US dollar was backed by gold? By 1971 that system was collapsing. Countries like France grew suspicious. They examined all the money the US was printing to finance the Vietnam War and concluded, you don't have enough gold to back this up. So France demanded to exchange their dollars for physical gold bars. US gold reserves started draining like a bathtub with the plug pulled. If this continued, the US would go bankrupt. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and effectively announced, "Psych. We're not giving you gold anymore." This was the Nixon shock. He unilaterally canceled the direct convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Overnight, the US dollar became a fiat currency backed by nothing but faith and credit. The dollar's value began plummeting. Superpower status was shaky. They needed a new anchor. If money wasn't backed by gold, what's the one thing the entire world needs even more than gold? Energy. In 1974, the US sent Treasury Secretary William Simon to Saudi Arabia with a very specific mission. It was a gangster move of the highest caliber. The deal: the US promises to protect the House of Saud militarily. We'll sell you F-15s tanks and guard your oil fields forever. In exchange, Saudi Arabia must price all oil sales exclusively in US dollars. Saudi Arabia must invest surplus oil profits back into US Treasury bonds, essentially lending the money back to America. This birthed the petrodollar. This transformed the physics of the global economy. Since Saudi Arabia dominated the oil market through OPEC, everyone else followed suit. If you're Japan and need oil, you must buy US dollars first. If you're Brazil and need oil, you must buy US dollars first. This created perpetual artificial demand for the US dollar. It meant the United States could run massive deficits, print endless quantities of money, and purchase cheap goods from China, and the dollar wouldn't collapse because the world needed dollars to keep the lights on. While other countries worry about their trade balance, the US can write checks that never bounce because it owns both the bank and the gas station. While bankers were locking down oil, the US unleashed a weapon the Soviet Union had no defense against. It wasn't a missile. It was MTV. Political scientist Joseph Nye calls this soft power. Hard power is forcing compliance with guns. Soft power is making others desire what you want. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had more tanks. They arguably had superior rockets for a period. But their lifestyle looked miserable: gray concrete buildings, bread lines, terrible footwear. Meanwhile, the US was broadcasting images of Baywatch, Coca-Cola, Levi's, and rock and roll across the Iron Curtain. You cannot underestimate this weapon's importance. There's a famous story about Levi's 501 jeans in the Soviet Union. They were illegal to import. On the black market, a pair of American jeans cost a month's salary. Why? Because wearing them signified freedom. Coolness. America. The CIA actually understood this. They covertly funded tours for American jazz musicians and abstract expressionist painters to visit Europe. The message: look how creative and free we are. In Russia, the government dictates what you paint. Here you can do whatever you want. In 1990, when the first McDonald's opened in Moscow, thousands of Russians stood in line for hours in freezing temperatures, not just for a Big Mac, but for a taste of the American dream. By exporting its culture, the U.S. colonized the world's minds. Before a U.S. soldier ever sets foot in a country, the children there are already watching Marvel movies, listening to Taylor Swift, and using iPhones. It makes it extraordinarily difficult for a foreign government to oppose America when their own population is addicted to American culture. The U.S. didn't just conquer territory. It conquered cool. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The U.S. declared victory, but history didn't end. The battlefield just shifted to a new dimension: cyberspace. Remember when I mentioned the military invented the internet? In the 90s, they handed it to the private sector, and the U.S. captured the digital high ground before anyone realized there was a hill to climb. Look at the internet today. Who controls it? Search, Google. American. Social media, Meta, Facebook. American. Business operating systems, Microsoft. American. Smartphones, Apple. American. Cloud infrastructure, Amazon AWS. American. These aren't merely companies. They are the infrastructure of modern existence. If you're a German startup, you run on Amazon servers. If you're a Brazilian influencer, you live on Instagram. This gives the United States an intelligence advantage that's terrifying. Through programs like PRISM, revealed by Edward Snowden, U.S. intelligence agencies technically have backdoor access to data flowing through these massive platforms. While China has attempted to build its own walled garden with Alibaba and WeChat, the rest of the world effectively lives in a digital colony of the United States. Data is the new oil. And just like in 1974, the U.S. controls the pipelines. We've established that America is playing with a stacked deck. It has the land, the money printer, the military, and the internet. But here's the plot twist: the house of cards is trembling. Looking at current data, the United States faces 3 existential threats that geography and aircraft carriers cannot resolve. Threat number 1, the debt spiral. Remember the infinite money glitch we discussed? Turns out infinity has limits. As of September 30, 2024, the federal debt was $35.5 trillion. That number is so enormous the human brain cannot process it. Here's a statistic that will keep you awake. Interest on the debt in fiscal year 2024 was $1,126.5 billion, an increase of $251 billion from fiscal year 2023. The U.S. government now spends more money on interest payments for its debt than on the entire defense budget. We're spending more to pay yesterday's credit card bills than on the military that secures the empire. If the world ever stops trusting the dollar, that debt becomes a suicide vest. Threat number 2, weaponizing the dollar backfires. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. did something unprecedented. It froze hundreds of billions of Russia's reserves and kicked them out of the SWIFT banking system. It was supposed to be a financial nuclear weapon, but it had an unintended side effect. Every other country, China, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, watched and thought, if Washington gets angry at us, they can delete our money overnight. This fear kick-started the de-dollarization trend. We're witnessing the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now others. They're actively building alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar. Saudi Arabia is even discussing selling oil in Chinese yuan. If the petro-yuan becomes reality, the petrodollar dies, and with it the American privilege of printing cheap money. Threat number 3, the empire within. Finally, the biggest threat isn't in Beijing or Moscow. It's in Washington. Internal polarization in the U.S. has reached levels not seen since the Civil War, where we began this video. A superpower can survive external enemies. It cannot survive when half the crew tries to sink the ship because they despise the captain. So how did America become a superpower? It wasn't magic. It was a combination of: number 1, geography. The best real estate on earth. Number 2, opportunity. Getting wealthy while Europe burned in 2 world wars. Number 3, strategy. Rigging the global financial system through Bretton Woods and the petrodollar. Number 4, innovation. Using the military to build the digital age. The United States didn't just win the game. It purchased the casino, wrote the rulebook, and hired the bouncers. But history has a brutal law: reversion to the mean. No empire lasts forever. The British believed the sun would never set on their empire. The Romans thought they were eternal. The United States has enjoyed an incredible 80-year run as the undisputed king of the hill. But the world is changing. The map is being redrawn. The question isn't how America became a superpower. The real question you should be asking today is, what happens to the world when it isn't? If you want to survive the geopolitical shifts coming in the next decade, you need to pay attention. We'll be covering the rise of the global south and the AI revolution in upcoming videos. Do you think the US dollar will lose its reserve status in our lifetime, or is the American system too big to fail? Let me know in the comments below. I read the ones that don't look like bots. If you learned something new today, destroy that like button like it's the Berlin Wall and hit subscribe to join us for the next deep dive. Thanks for watching. Stay curious,